Hey, everybody. I'm very glad to welcome a friend of mine to the program today, Hassan El-Tayyab, who is the Friends Committee on National Legislation's lead lobbyist on Middle East policy. He is responsible for FCNL with the various coalitions that work on these issues. His writings and commentaries have been featured in numerous news outlets, including CNN, BBC World News, The Hill, Al Jazeera, The Huffington Post, The Intercept, The Young Turks, and more. Hi, Hassan. How are you?
Marianne, how's it going? So good to see you.
Thank you. Always good to see you. And you and I have been talking for a long time about how we needed to have a public conversation about, particularly about Yemen. When I was running myself last year, I talked a lot about how immoral it was that the United States was giving aerial support to a genocidal war being perpetrated, prosecuted by Saudi Arabia against Yemen. We were told by President Biden that there would be a whole new day when it came to foreign policy in relation to human rights. We'll talk about the larger issue a little bit later. But he spoke specifically in terms of Yemen. When he came into office, there seemed a moment at least where things were really changing. And I think now what we need from you is to understand what did change and what still needs to change. So if you could give us the sort of the scoop, what's going on with Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iran, the United States, and how do we break the blockade that is causing so much damage?
Thank you so much for having me on and highlighting this really critical issue that just does not get talked about enough. And it's the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and it's a crisis that the United States has helped fuel with our military support to the Saudi UAE-led coalition. For more than 6 years, Saudi Arabia, has imposed an air, land, and sea blockade on Yemen that's restricted the flow of vital food, fuel, medicine, and humanitarian aid into the country. These restrictions have been a leading driver in the humanitarian crisis that's pushed 16 million people to the edge of famine. The World Food Program actually is saying that 400,000 children are suffering from a severe acute malnutrition and actually could die in the coming weeks or months if urgent action isn't taken. So it's really critical that we're having this conversation. The Biden administration came in, did some things right, and did some things really wrong. They came in and they said, we're going to restore aid, humanitarian aid, USAID funding to all parts of Yemen. Great decision. They said they're going to lift the foreign terror designation on the Houthis, which is another great decision that they made to make sure that we could continue seeing delivery of humanitarian aid to all parts of Yemen. They said that, he came in and also said that we're going to end U.S. support for offensive operations in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. Now, that sounds great, but the devil is in the details. What is offensive? What does defensive mean? If we're going to be ending offensive operations, does that include the blockade? Does that include all maintenance support for Saudi warplanes? And unfortunately, what we've seen is that key parts of our military support have remained, and that is basically continuing and perpetuating the war. We haven't said, Saudi Arabia, we're going to completely cut off your air, the aerial support that we're providing in the form of maintenance for these Saudi warplanes. They depend on the steady flow of spare parts and maintenance from U.S. civilian contractors and Pentagon officials to keep these planes in the air. And unfortunately, that's led to a continuation of this horrible blockade policy that's cut off the flow, in the past 6 months. It's really pinched off the flow of fuel. And that's really just been a disaster for the people of Yemen and pushed so many people to the edge of famine.
Why is Saudi Arabia fighting Yemen to begin with?
So there is a complicated history in Yemen. I'm not going to try to say I'm going to give you all the whole picture, but here's the gist of it. In 2011, there was the Arab Spring uprising that pushed out 30-year-long dictator in President Saleh. They had a nonviolent revolution, peaceful resistance. He stepped down. He wasn't forced to leave the country, and they installed Hadi, who was then vice president and was supposed to be moving on after, I think 2 or 3 years or so, when they would then move to a more representative form of government with regular elections. Unfortunately, as these things go, he, delayed leaving office. There was a lot of corruption issues. The Houthis felt like they were being, oppressed and getting the short end of the stick economically, and they rose up and actually overthrew the Hadi government. Hadi fled to Riyadh and asked the Saudi-led coalition for support. Saudi Arabia, joined with the UAE, other Arab League states, and with the backing of the U.S., U.K., France, and Canada, and other Western allies, proceeded to start this the Yemen war, the Saudi UAE-led war in Yemen, and they have long just had, when I say they, the Saudi Arabia has long had dominance over Yemen. They really value this strategic location because of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. They ship millions of barrels of oil. It's a strategic point. They have long-term plans. The UAE also has plans for Yemen. They're trying to annex key pieces of the country in Socotra and Param Islands, and they've just used this as a launching point for a war. There's more to it than that, but that's essentially the gist of it. And the Obama administration at the time, they were trying to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal, which I think is a very important initiative to try to, curb Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. I'm completely in support of that. But unfortunately, the Obama administration basically told Saudi Arabia that we're going to support your war in Yemen. Please just don't interfere with the JCPOA talks. And that was a really terrible, disastrous decision that's destabilized the Middle East. It's caused massive suffering. 250,000 people have died because of this war, in large part because of the airstrikes, because of the blockade. And it's actually showing no signs of stopping right now. I wish we were further along in this process, but until we get Saudi Arabia to admit that they've essentially lost this war, and that they cannot use the blockade, mass starvation tactics to basically, try to push the Houthis to a surrender. It's just not happening. And what we need to do here in the U.S. is make sure that we're not militarily supporting the Saudi-led coalition, and that we're urging at all, doing everything we can to basically get this blockade to be lifted as a humanitarian act and decouple it from ongoing negotiations, because using starvation as leverage is never okay.
How does this fit in your mind, to Biden's larger, more comprehensive claim that human rights would be brought back to the center of foreign policy during his presidency?
Oftentimes when people run for office, they say a lot of things that we all want to hear. And then when they get into office, that reality is much different. And I don't think what Biden has done since he's come into office, it's definitely better than Trump in a lot of ways, but far short of a human rights-based foreign policy. The war in Yemen, that ongoing military support for the coalition, is one example of us kind of compromising, prioritizing human rights. Our, support, while Israel was bombing Gaza, we announced, I should say, the press leaked the story that the Biden administration was in process of selling 735 joint direct attack munitions, JDAMs is what they call them, the same bombs as Israel was dropping on Gaza. Horrible signal. The Biden administration also said that they were going to, prioritize having this checks and balances, having Congress do its thing and the executive branch do its thing. And we've seen airstrikes on Iraq and Syria that have not been authorized by Congress. So those are in the bad column. I think the good column is that the Biden administration is pursuing talks with Iran, the joint, comprehensive plan of action, the JCPOA, trying to, get back into that nuclear accord. I think that's a really positive move. Unfortunately, We're still not in there, and we're still having those sanctions in place. That maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration started when he pulled out of the deal. Now that whole maximum pressure regime is still in place on Iran. So it's definitely a mixed bag. We're doing everything we can here on the Hill, trying to build momentum, build support for actual human rights based foreign policy. And I really appreciate you giving me this platform and so many great activists this platform to help us get from point A to point B, because that's what we need and that's what we want for the Middle East.
I don't understand why they have not, and why they will not remove those maximum pressure sanctions on Iran. I mean, Trump put them there as his own policy when he removed us from the Iran deal. So I don't understand the United States now telling Iran that they better, behave a certain way without our first saying we will remove the maximum pressure sanctions. And I think sometimes people don't realize what those, people hear phrases like maximum pressure sanctions. What that means is people can't get their medicine. What that means is people can't get dialysis. What that means is people can't get insulin. What that means is that people can't get food. And how this can be used as a mode of foreign policy just seems barbaric to me. Is there any insight that you have into why the Biden administration feels that this is a good thing to hold on to while they're in process of trying to get back into the deal?
Yeah, I mean, so I cannot speak for the Biden administration, but I will say that COVID-19 is a huge priority for this administration. I do think that they have been doing a good job as far as, trying to take care of some of these domestic issues. And they're really prioritizing and focusing on rebuilding our economy, infrastructure investment, tackling COVID-19 here at home. And so they're preoccupied. I'm not going to lie. They have a tough job. I'm not trying to say that they don't. So there's that focus on what's happening here in the United States, which I understand. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is what's happening abroad, kind of being left to the wayside. The JCPOA is a critical deal. In my opinion, what I would have much preferred is that we, lift the sanctions on Iran and, say if we need to, we can put them back if you're not going to come back into compliance with the deal, but
Exactly.
We're not going to use that as leverage. I'll give the Biden administration credit on a couple pieces. They did issue a general license for Iran to ensure the flow. This was just a week or two ago. They issued a general license for Iran for COVID-related relief. So that means vaccines, PPE, testing kits, respirators, sanitizer, all COVID relief supplies and vaccines are now, they've clarified that those are not covered by sanctions. And shortly thereafter, Iran was able to, spend about 100 million Swiss francs and purchase 16 million vaccines.
That is a big deal.
That's a big deal. They relieved some energy sector sanctions. So, it's not like they haven't done anything, but the fact is the bulk of the maximum pressure, regime is still in place. We need to put pressure on the administration to lift it, not just in Iran, but everywhere. We cannot be using sanctions, these broad-based economic sanctions that punish civilians and really don't do a lot to hold leaders of countries like Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Syria accountable. It punishes the people. In Cuba, exactly, the embargo on Cuba. So this whole policy about sanctions, is really critical. We're pushing some legislation on the National Defense Authorization Act to, at the very least, try to get a humanitarian impact of sanctions report so we can see in the light of day how these sanctions are impacting innocent men, women, and children all over the world. And I'm looking forward to working with Congress and trying to get as much support for that as possible.
Well, it's a very old-fashioned conversation, the idea that if the United States put sanctions on a country, it would make the people so miserable they would rise up against their government, which is absurd. And in far too many cases, including those that you've mentioned, the people are aware that their suffering is not coming from their government in these cases. It's coming from the United States sanctions, which only makes them support, in some cases, governments that they would not otherwise support. Now, on the issue of Israel and Palestine, you and I had lunch with a gentleman not too long ago who works very closely on the Palestinian issue. Both of you were talking about the fact that we have, I know that Jared Kushner had withdrawn some aid to the Palestinians. Isn't a large part of this not only the size of the aid that is given to Israel, but also restoring some aid and very much expanding aid to Palestinians?
So the Biden administration, let's put this in the good column. They did restore massive amounts of funding to UNRWA, the UN agency that's doing critical work in the West Bank and Gaza, providing humanitarian, support, education, resources. So I put that in the good column. And we need to keep supporting, humanitarian assistance for the Palestinians, for people in Gaza. So that's something that we're definitely happy that happened. Unfortunately, on the accountability side, there's much to be desired. And a bill that we're working on right now was introduced by Representative Betty McCollum. And this bill is HR 2590. It's on, we have an action page on the FCNL site. And what it does is it tries to make sure that we have, at the very least, end use restrictions on our military aid to Israel. We got to make sure that we're not allowing any U.S. funds to go to annexation of Palestinian land. We got to make sure that U.S. funds are not going to detain Palestinian children in Israeli military courts or in military jurisdiction. And we also have to make sure that no U.S. funds are being used to demolish Palestinian homes. And just so we have some basic transparency, that's not the end of the conversation. That's really just the bare minimum. And we also need to push for a lifting of the blockade on Gaza. What's happening to the people of Gaza is just abhorrent. It really is. We've got 2 million people living in basically an open air prison. Now, what Hamas is doing, sending rockets into Israel is not okay. Hands down, that is just not okay at all. But we cannot have collective punishment for everybody else who, frankly, these are just innocent people. These are children. Any child under the age of 15 in Gaza right now has never lived in a place, that they could leave. They're stuck there. So freedom of movement is just not an option for people in Gaza right now. And, the 97% of the water is just not drinkable. I mean, I just can't even fathom that, and sometimes Palestinians only have 4 hours a day of electricity. So we need massive investment. We need reconstruction of Gaza after the war in May. I mean, that's just absolute critical. That's something else we're working on, is trying to, not only, support the reconstruction of Gaza, but try to end this cycle of violence and, bring folks together on the Hill, Palestinian civil society, to try to do something about this, because it's gone on far too long. I'm an optimist. I always think that, we can make progress. I do think that there's more people in the United States that, want to see a human rights-based foreign policy, that want to hold, Israel accountable and any government accountable that we're giving military assistance to. That's definitely positive. I think, having AOC, Rashida Tlaib, and Mark Pocan introduce joint resolutions of disapproval to block those weapon sales to Israel. When we heard that announcement of the $735 million weapon sale, I think that's definitely positive. We also have a new government in Israel. And I think that, we don't know the full answer to that. There's definitely, cause for skepticism and that things won't get any better. But, I'm going to keep pushing and trying to, do whatever I can here to build support on the Hill and off the Hill to try to move the conversation in the positive direction. And, well, let's have this conversation in another couple months, and we'll check in and see how we're doing.
When you spoke earlier about giving credit where credit is due to the Biden administration, and I certainly agree with that, but then you said, I know they're very busy. Well, the blink and there is the State Department. Nobody's asking Biden to do all the micromanagement 24 hours a day. There is a State Department that gets something along the line of $40 billion a year. So why is it, given that we do have a State Department to take the larger, more comprehensive view of these things, why don't we have a more human rights-centered foreign policy coming out of the Biden administration?
Great question. I'm not trying to give anybody a pass here, but I'm just looking into the head of the Biden administration. Trying to tackle COVID, I think, is their number one priority, and a lot of these other critical priorities are getting pushed to the side. Now, unfortunately, this is the way I see, a lot of people in DC, I think Ben Rhodes coined the term the blob. They see America's role in the world as we need to play a leadership role. We need to be a hegemon in the Middle East. We need to dominate. We need to, support our allies. We need to, push back against, bad guys like Iran, and fortunately, that whole line of thinking that the United States needs to be a hegemon in the Middle East and around the world, frankly, is a really destructive paradigm and something that we need to break out of, because it's not serving the United States. It's not serving the Middle East. And, if we don't get out of this line of thinking, we're going to see more and more and more violence. And that's exactly why I appreciate, having this conversation with you, because I don't think the American people want that paradigm. We don't want to be world cop. We don't want to be sanctioning, dozens of countries around the world just because we don't like their leadership. And when in fact, it's hurting civilians, not really doing, having the intended outcome. And so, you have a whole bunch of people in DC that do have this, this way of thinking about the world. And it is what it is. We're where we're at right now. And I think our job here is to, decolonize, our own minds, but also try to decolonize our government. Folks need to get engaged. I really believe the vast majority of Americans want to see a human rights-based foreign policy, not just rhetoric. We want to see it in practice.
Yes, I think the majority of Americans do want us to lead with our values. And the American people were conned. The American people were tricked into believing that with the war in Vietnam, we were standing up for our values. With the war in Iraq, we were standing up for our values. And as you've made very clear, and as everybody recognizes now, it was the opposite of standing up for our values. It was standing up for American militarism and the kind of hegemony that you were talking about. What are the ways that you, with your organization, Friends Committee is pretty famous for this. What are the ways that somebody listening to you right now can become active, can learn more about what you're doing, about what the organization is doing to help move forward a more human rights-centered foreign policy in the United States?
Thank you for that. Great question. One, keep listening to you. You have great commentary out there, and I think you offer a really fresh and wise perspective on a lot of these issues. Two, I would say, yeah, absolutely. On the question on Yemen, I would suggest folks go to endtheblockade.com. It's a website that our coalition has set up to drive letters to Congress to basically speak out about the blockade in Yemen and make sure that we're going to end end all U.S. complicity and get the Biden administration to put the pressure on Saudi Arabia needed to end the blockade. We have leverage. We have pending weapon sales. We can, suspend visas. We can, there's a lot we can do that we haven't done. We got to make it happen. I think Congress is what needs, we need to put pressure on Congress, to put pressure on the Biden administration, to put pressure on Saudi Arabia. So that's another thing. Endtheblockade.com.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
As long as we're on the topic of Saudi Arabia, of course, Biden had said, we understand the murder of Khashoggi and that Saudi Arabia would be recognized for the murderous, the Crown Prince and his murderous activity there. And yet recently Washington hosted, the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia? What was that about?
So the Biden administration, again, campaigned on making Mohammed bin Salman a pariah, saying that, they're going to hold Saudi Arabia accountable for what they're doing in Yemen, what they did to Khashoggi, the Tiger Squad. So there's a lot of talk right there. And instead of completely cutting off Saudi Arabia and cutting off the military and trying to push for accountability, they use a funny term. It's called recalibration. So I think they're trying to, do some stuff. We're going to, lift the FTO designation. We're going to cut off some support, going to cut off some weapons, but not really going all the way and saying, this is a toxic monarchy in the Middle East, and it's causing massive destruction for the people of Yemen. It's destabilizing the entire region. It's going to actually support Al-Qaeda in Yemen and beyond. I mean, we could go on about all of the destructive things that Saudi is doing. We haven't even talked about the climate crisis and, how we need to get off fossil fuels and how they keep pumping more and more fossil fuels into our atmosphere. So they've made the determination that it's better to recalibrate than to actually, completely reform the U.S.-Saudi alliance. I think that's a major mistake.
Is part of this recalibration having to do with Iran and trying to make sure there's enough of a buffer there and playing our cards that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a similar, situation where they're trying to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. They don't want Saudi to play the spoiler.
Right.
It's the same kind of calculation that the Obama administration made when they supported the Saudi-led coalition war in Yemen in the first place. And again, it's like gets right back to that idea that the United States needs to be a hegemon in the Middle East. And it's just more of the same old.
The thing is, they don't even do it well. They don't even do it well. If you really wanted a buffer that would protect us from overreach by Iran, we had one. It was called Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The Iraq-Iran wars kept Iran very busy and powerless in ways that it is not powerless anymore. Well, thank you, Hassan. Thank you for all the work that you do. And as I've said to you before, anytime you want to talk about any of these things, we talk privately, but anytime you want to talk about any of this publicly on any of my platforms, you are more than welcome. Just text me and say, I got something I want to say. And I'm more than glad to give everybody the opportunity to hear the very important messages that you give. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Marianne. Really appreciate the discussion. And, I hope people do take action. We do need to force a Yemen war powers resolution vote to cut off all U.S. support for the Saudi UAE-led coalition's war in Yemen. That's my top foreign policy priority right now, and I'm glad to have a platform to talk about it.
Okay, everybody, you heard it. EndTheBlockade.com. Do something. Thank you, Hassan. Thank you so much.